Hello, everybody. My name is Alwin. I am presenting today on climate risks for businesses, specifically wanting to address how businesses in different industries right now are assessing their climate risks and preparing for that. So climate risk is a pretty broad area. So first, I'm going to give a quick introduction on what climate risk means, why it's important, what the current state is, what's going on in that space. Then I'm going to dive into two different case studies. The first is in the airlines industry, and the second one is in the retail industry. And then finally, just a quick conclusion with what I think this industry is moving towards and next steps. So first, an introduction of climate risks. So what is climate risk for businesses? So climate risk is something that most businesses are not currently focusing on. They're mostly focusing on their impacts. So as Abby and Eric's presentation earlier mentioned, a lot of these companies are starting to do a lot of carbon disclosures, things around carbon accounting, what their emissions are, which is very important. And this has increased about tenfold in the past 25 years, which is incredibly great. But that only takes one side of the approach. The other side of that is how does the changing climate outside impact the operations of a company and their revenue and their future as well. Climate change is a pretty direct risk to a lot of business operations, and it's going to impact them over the next few years. So being able to be prepared for that is something that a lot of businesses need to do, but aren't doing right now. If you look at it, a lot of businesses see climate change as a reputational risk or short-term regulatory risk, and they put this similarly under the marketing budget or under the regulatory budget, but very rarely in a financial or a business sense. And we can tell this because we look at different financial statements and seeing how they portray climate. So first, a lot of businesses will see pretty significant impacts. Climate risk will affect about 90% of the S&P Global 1200 by 2050, and by the 2090s, it's going to be close to 100% of companies. So many companies are going to be impacted over the next few years. In fact, next few decades. But even within the next few years, this is already happening. 60% of companies already say that climate change is having an impact. And yet businesses are not taking the right steps. Only about a quarter of businesses actually have a formal risk mitigation step that focuses on climate-related risks, and only about 25% of them actually put it in their financial statements. So this is something that they haven't quite done yet. And I think if there's one statistic that we should remember, it's that just 215 of the biggest companies have said that they will face about $1 trillion in losses from climate change in the next 5 years. And for comparison, $1 trillion is about the GDP of like Saudi Arabia, like a top 20 country by GDP. So it's pretty significant. So the current state of reporting. So there are some frameworks and different reporting requirements that have been created, mostly in the European Union, but a lot of businesses do not currently follow them, either because it's not required or because they don't have the right resources for it. So one framework that I found that has become pretty popular is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. So this was a council that was created and chaired by Michael Bloomberg and a few others, and they have a set of 11 recommendations around climate disclosures for businesses. So as you can see, it generally falls into 4 different categories around governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics. And risk management is a part of that. But that is actually one of the ones that people follow the least. So this framework's already been adopted by different countries around the world. The US has not quite truly adopted it yet, but they're currently in talks about including it in future climate regulatory requirements. So the hope is that this will become required in the future. So important to note is out of the 11 recommended disclosures, only 4% of companies that they surveyed actually do all 11. Of course, this is an improvement from 2017 when there were none, but 4% is still extremely low. And especially when risk is the one that is least reported on, that is a pretty big concern. So it's pretty clear that climate risk impacts businesses and a lot of them are not prepared. So what I wanted to do is dive a little deeper into 2 different industries where I was able to gather industry reports and do interviews and get additional information. So the first industry I wanted to talk about is the airlines industry. So the airlines industry, from most people, they would see climate change as not massively impactful to airlines. They would see it more on the side of like, it'll impact crops, it'll impact energy industries, and so on and so forth. And airlines is probably a little less so, and they see it more as the emissions that airlines produce. But there's actually a lot of different impacts that climate change will have on airlines. So the first one is physical infrastructure. So as climate changes, a lot of the local infrastructure at airports and for aircraft is going to change. A lot of airports currently are located in low-lying areas where it's very prone to flooding as sea levels change and as precipitation increases. And so a lot of airports don't have the current infrastructure built out to withstand that. Additionally, when there's high heat days, icy conditions, which become more common, this impacts the runway integrity, which means that airplanes can't take off. And finally, a lot of aircraft are only allowed to operate within certain conditions. In fact, what they found is with the current change in climate, already about 15% of scheduled flights are already not allowed to be flown during certain conditions. They have to either delay them or choose different aircraft, and that's not always a possibility. The second thing is health and safety risks. So as changing climate happens, as with many other places, there will be new health and safety risks, but especially for airlines. So at the airport, a lot of employees actually stand out on the runway, and you can't create shade for these employees because, it's a runway. So what ends up happening is a lot of them face higher temperatures, heat stroke, and unsafe working conditions for these employees. Additionally, airports will now have higher heating and cooling costs, which a lot of them may not be prepared for. And this one is particularly interesting is climate conditions such as higher temperatures lead to higher turbulence. So they've already found that the turbulence for transatlantic flights right now has already increased, I think, about 10% in terms of the amount of incidents, just because of the current climate change, and that's going to continue to increase. This leads to more injuries to passengers and also damage to aircraft that needs to be repaired. Additionally, operations and maintenance will need to change. A lot of new policies will need to be implemented. So rising temperatures leads to higher fuel costs. For every 1 degree change in temperature Celsius, that leads to about 2 to 3% increase in fuel, and potentially even more depending on the type of aircraft. So this can lead to problems. Additionally, storms cause flight delays. People have to go around them or even cancel flights, and that increases costs. And desertification in a lot of places leads to additional particulate matter in the air, which leads to damage to aircraft engines, and that increases maintenance costs as well. And this one's particularly interesting is customer demand changes. As people change where they want to go because of climate change, this leads to changes in flight routes. For example, if Miami starts flooding, people will want to travel to Miami a lot less. But currently, a lot of flights are scheduled for there or even have hubs there, and that's going to impact a lot of operations as well. And finally, government regulations is a pretty big impact as well. So I did a deep dive into American Airlines, and what they've done is they've identified 12 strategically important sites that they've considered particularly impacted. They've done a study on their operations with their aircraft certifications and the likelihood of customer demand changes. And while this is really good and probably an industry leader, their risk mitigation steps aren't great. First, they've only identified mostly their hubs as strategically important. With their operations, they found out which aircraft might not be able to run, but they haven't done anything to fix that. And finally, with the customer demand changes, they mostly focus on business travel and not regular consumer travel. So the second industry I want to look at is retail industry. So one big change is within supply chain. As new climates become more common, the availability of certain raw materials and the supply chains will be disrupted. So that means a lot of crops can't be grown as much, and supply chains will be disrupted. There's also increased cost of production. This leads to a lot of higher capital and variable costs, whether it's because of fuel, whether it's because of fertilizer, or even just the fact that there's going to be a higher amount of loss per seed grown. So I think that's a pretty significant impact as well. So there are also a lot of human impacts as well. So as retail is pretty focused on where stores are built, as these things change, whether it's hurricanes or this can displace customers. And a lot of stores, once you've bought the real estate, you can't move that. And that's something that needs to be included. And finally, asset management. a lot of shifting climates are going to impact building and inventory management. So a lot of that is going to be increasing in cost as well. So I did a deep dive on Walmart, and Walmart's actually an industry leader when it comes to climate risk, and they've done a pretty good job of like checking which climates are going to affect which facilities, and they've identified which of their 25 most common commodities are going to be impacted, and they've found that cocoa, coffee, and cotton were most at risk. And then they also did a study of like all of their current stores and how likely climate's going to impact it. So red is obviously most impacted, and yellow is slightly impacted. So what has this shown? What this has shown is businesses need to start prioritizing climate risk in every industry, even ones where it might not necessarily be something that they currently have thought about. It's pretty evident that climate change is going to impact them, but most of them have not actually seen it as a financial risk. Either that, or they don't even have risk mitigation steps. So there are currently frameworks like the TCFD, which are in place, but many of them are not using it or do so incompletely. So overall, this is something that needs to be changed, and my research over the past quarter has shown that this is improvements have been made, but only gradually and only in certain industries. Thank you.
I'm curious, from your research, do you think the bigger challenge in climate risk assessment is still figuring out like what those downstream effects are, or is it we already know the effects? It's just figuring out how it impacts like where the impacts are going to be and how to like assign the dollar value to them.
Sure. So I think it depends on every industry. I think some industries it's pretty clear. So the way that a lot of generally, it's seen risks are split into two. There is transitional risks and then physical risks. So transitional risks I didn't really focus on, but that's particularly along the lines of as people want to focus or start buying more sustainable products, as people start shifting to more renewable source of energy, how's that going to impact that energy transition? How's that going to impact your business? Within the physical risk, a lot of that is along the lines of what I mentioned here. I think most companies aren't thinking about all of their climate risks, and a lot of that is not captured. Many of them don't mention it in their financial reports. Many of them don't mention it in earnings statements or press conferences or any of that. So to me, it's hard to tell if it's because they simply don't know and haven't put in the effort to figure that out, or if they know and they just don't want to publicly release it. And I think that's actually one of the biggest reasons why climate risk reporting needs to become a requirement is a lot of investors are in the dark right now. They don't know this company that I've invested in. For example, if I buy a stock in American Airlines, do I know what the risk is over the next 10 to 20 years? Most of them don't. And I think that's why reporting is going to be important, especially for not just the companies themselves, but investors as well. Sure.
I got the mic. So I'm curious what types of like baseline climate models or weather models you've found these companies use to forecast risk. My understanding is there's not a lot of consensus and some gaps in the types of information we can access and the accuracy of these forward-looking models. I was curious if you came across any excellent models, or are these companies using publicly available data, or are they creating their own?
So that wasn't something that I really looked into, but this was something that you actually taught me, which I'm happy to share with everyone, is when it comes to like these models, there's a lot of short-term and long-term. So weather predictions as well as climate predictions, but there's very little in the middle section with seasonal and sub-seasonal. So what that means is like weather is like within like predicting what will happen in the next week or two, and climate being more on a long term, like the next 2 to 5 years plus. But within the short or medium term, that isn't something that there's been a lot of climate modeling. So that is something that needs to be conducted. And actually that's incredibly relevant for, I would say for businesses even more so, because admittedly a lot of CEOs and executives, they're not going to be at these companies for 20 to 30 years. So a lot of them aren't going to be worried about what is the climate risk to my company 20, 30 years when I'm not even running this company. But they will be worried about what is happening in the next year, especially because that pertains to earnings reports. So I do think if modeling improves within that middle section, that actually will be much more relevant to what's going on for businesses for modeling climate risk.
Okay, let's thank Alwin one more time.